So good evening. Thank you all for being here. Before I actually start the lecture properly and talk a little bit about the exhibition, which, as Bunhui said, was sort of seeded through with concepts that I explored in my PhD, I also have a round of thank yous to give. And of course, the first person I would like to thank is Bunhui himself for inviting me to curate for the first time, and to curate basically an aspect of my PhD thesis. But there were many, many people who made this show possible, and as if you go upstairs, you'll see it's a pretty big undertaking. There are over 80 works. It required a lot of help from both within the Indian art world, and tonight I would very, very much like to acknowledge the Asia Society Museum's staff themselves. So the first person to thank is Marian Kokot, and I'm going to go through the list, which I've had written down for me so I don't miss anyone out. Adriana Proza, Michelle Yun, Claire McQuan, Jennifer Lima, who is the registrar and without which you wouldn't be seeing anything today, Hiro Sato, and as well as the editors of the catalogue, Lisa Hook, and then we have Nancy Bloom, Sarah McCaffrey, without whom I wouldn't be here because nobody would have booked my flight, and I would have missed any airport pickups that I had to get because I'm like that. I'd also like to thank Kelly Ma and Clayton Vogel, Rachel Cooper, Rachel Rosado, the two Rachels, Anne Kirkup, Shane Doty, Masako Shiba, Marie-Louise Keane, and of course Elaine Mergeren. Poor Elaine, I always have problems with her surname, so I hope I got that correct. As well as Oscar De La Fey and his crew. So thank you to all of you, and I'm so happy to be here, and thank you guys for coming as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is say a little bit about the exhibition, and since I'm a complete control freak, and from tomorrow I shan't be here, I'm going to give you a little sense of how it works as a show and what is the best way, advisable way to go and have a look at it. So it's an exhibition that is based not chronologically, and it is not a survey. So these are the two things it is not. So what is it? It's an exploration. It's called the Progressive Revolution because it concentrates on a group of artists called the Progressive Artists Group who came together in 1947, just after Indian independence. And as a show, the thematics of the show explore two main concepts. And one of them is nationalism, and the other one is secularism. Now, what do I mean by nationalism? So, what I mean by nationalism is not the entity that we see today and are constantly castigating as increasingly narrow, closing in on ourselves, and in some ways a very regressive way of dealing with identity politics. Instead, the investigation of the nation that I hope you will witness upstairs is a very plural one. And it's plural in two ways. Firstly, it's plural because it's inclusive. And it's an idea of nationality that includes people from different castes, creeds, religion. And secondly, it is inclusive also because it looks outward. So it's a vision of a nation that is also inherently within itself quite international. So not a parochial nationalism. And the second wing, of course, is secularism. And that is something we'll be discussing a lot today in terms of how you could potentially read the works upstairs and what I actually mean by the terminology of the secular. So some of you might might have been here for Faisal's lecture, which gave a very theoretic backdrop to the notion of the secular in an Indian context. This show isn't dense and theoretical. It makes its argument in a visual form, and you should be able to see what I'm talking about when I say secular, as I'll take you through the images. So there are three ways in which this show is split up. The first section is called Progressives in Their Time, and this is an exploration of who the progressives are, as well as the initial composition of the progressive artist group. So we've reconstructed the first inaugural show of the progressive artists, and there were 6 artists who were very much associated with this, with a sort of foundational show, and that's Souza, Ara, Raza, Bakre, Gade, and Hussein. And these 6 then induct others. Some of them go off to London or to France, and a new wave joins this group in 1953. So the terminology of the progressive is a pretty loose one in the way in which it's being played out within the show, but it's basically dealing with these core group of friends and their very, very close associates. So that's progressive in their times, and that's the first section. The second section, which actually goes through both level 1 side room as well as much of level 2, is called Nation, is sort of Nation International. And that is one that deals with modernism, with the idea of the Indian modern, but also relates it not just to, how these artists are reading Indian tradition, but also how they're looking more widely into Asia in general and the things that they're inspired by. Now, the way we've done this, and this is where Bunhui was particularly taxed by me, is that I wanted to use the Rockefeller collection of Asian antiquities to make this particular dialogue about Indian modernism. So we've contrasted works by the modern Indian artists by drawing from the Rockefeller antiques and miniature paintings and their permanent collection. Not all of it, but some of it. And it's strategically placed so that you could see the influences that, India and Asia, the past, was having on the definition of the Indian modern. But of course, there's another reason why specifically we've chosen the Rockefeller collection, other than the fact that it's the permanent collection of Asia Society. And that is, of course, because the Asia Society was founded by J.D. Rockefeller III, as you all know, in 1954. And that gave me an opportunity to make, I hope, an interesting, certainly a contentious, and I'm sure people will have lots of comments about the American modern and its interconnection and interpenetration with other kinds of modernism. And this is something that I'll sort of flesh out as I carry on and give you images and examples and things like that. But the narrative here is very much dealing with how modern Indian art and modern Asian art, but specifically Indian art, has often been seen as derivative of the West, right? So I'm using a collection that is technically built up by the Rockefellers, who are in some ways their own kind of quintessential modern moment for America, and taking from that collection and contrasting it with the Indian moderns to say that there are other ways of looking at modernism, not just as a one-way street of derivation from the West. But there's something else going on here, and we need to be a lot more open with the way in which we talk about the modern. Okay, then the third section of the show is called Masters of the Game, and it's got iconic works from each of the sort of the greats who are associated with the progressive artist group. Okay, having done that, and sort of taken you through how I'd like you to see the show. Of course, I can't, I'm now going to actually set the stage for what is happening when the progressives come together in that moment in 1947. So it's called Midnight and the Moderns, Mapping Progressive Past, Proposing Secular Futures. As the clock chimed the midnight hour on the 15th of August 1947, the subcontinent threw off the shackles of the British Raj. India was free. However, India might be free, but at the same moment as its birth, as a nation, something else was also happening in the subcontinent, and that was partition. So, and this is what you can see from the map that I'm showing you over here. So South Asia is basically divided, right, by a man called Cyril Redcliffe, who's called in by the British to divide the subcontinent. And what you have is the formation of India in the middle. You can see that. And on one side, you have East Pakistan, and on the other side, you have West Pakistan. And the Radcliffe line is drawn quite late in the day. So independence is announced almost simultaneously as the announcements of when the borders are coming down. Now, this is quite important. It's also quite traumatic because as people cross the borders, millions die. So it's a very bloody birth for both India and Pakistan, and that is something to remember in the background of this. The other thing to remember with the Radcliffe lines and the kind of formation of the two nations here is that two nations with completely different national dialogues are born. And the two dialogues go like this. India is secular, and that's its foundational logic. It's secular, which means it's multi-religious. It includes all religions, whereas Pakistan is founded specifically as a Muslim nation, right? It's where the subcontinent's Muslims are meant to go, or at least that's the foundational logic. So this is quite important for us today because the progressive artist group who come together as I said, in the aftermath of Indian independence, are very much talking about defining a new art for a new India. But what kind of art would this be? Well, it would be a secular art. And within its ranks, within this original core six, and we keep going back and saying, why are the progressives so important? Why do they dominate all dialogues about Indian modernism? And I think the reason that they do this, even though as a group they weren't together that long, by 1956 you already see them dissolving. The reason is because in this foundational movement, they're giving voice to an idea of a really secular, really open, fluid concept of the nation. And how do they do that? It's because from within their ranks, they represent Raza and Hussein, a Muslim. They also they're really poor, so they're not upper class artists. You have Hindus in the mix. You have a Dalit like Ara in the mix. You have Souza, who is known as a quintessential Indian modern, but Souza comes from Goa, which at this point is a Portuguese colony, and it is a Portuguese colony all the way till 1961. So this notion of the Indian modern at this period is very, very diverse, and that's why they're so important. So before I go on to talk about their story, which you can also see upstairs, I think we should have a little bit of fun. So the little bit of fun, well, okay, that's Prime Minister Nehru, and that's not a little bit of fun, because there he is releasing the dove of peace. And this dove appears elsewhere in this presentation in the work of Hussein. So look out for it when it arrives. Now's our bit of fun. So our bit of fun is based around a TV show that is really popular in Britain, and it's called Goodness Gracious Me. And it's done by a group of British Indian actors, and they perform these little skits. And one of the sort of running gags through it is this father and son combination. And the father, who is sort of a very traditional man, is called Mr. India. And Mr. India's job is to educate his son on all things Indian. But the boy is incredibly westernized. And so he keeps bringing these things, these sort of instances of Western culture to his dad and saying, look, Dad, you know, what do you think about this? Don't you think this is wonderful? And the dad goes, yeah, it's Indian. So, yeah, I mean, you have a whole kind of plethora of these things that are supposedly Indian. The British royal family is Indian because they live in a big house with a joint family. Moreover, their kids have arranged marriages. Indian, for sure. So, this image, which I'm showing you now, is a skit from where the son is extolling the virtues of Renaissance art, only to be told, you got it, the painters are Indian. So, Da Vinci, says the father, is definitely Indian. He comes from Bhavnagar. Can't you see? Indian. So then the son goes, yeah, but what about the Last Supper, Dad? You can't say that's painted by an Indian. So his dad says, yes, it is. It's by a Goan, in fact. And the proof? Well, where are the women? They're only men. They're all Indian because the women are in the kitchen, no? So the little son, in absolute exasperation, and there you see him getting really annoyed, says, okay, fine. And what about David? Is that Indian as well? So the father says, no, because he has a very small. So no, I just wanted to show you that because actually we all laugh, right? And it's so patently ridiculous that these sort of icons of the Renaissance and Western culture should be considered Indian. But at the same time, how hard do we laugh with the Western fixation that everything Asian or Indian, in our case, is actually Euro-American? So, and the dialogue in modernism per se, where the West got there first. So I don't usually see us laughing at that. In fact, we take it for granted. So this show is very much an overturning of that dialogue. Not to say that everything is Indian, but to say that some things are Indian, and let's acknowledge that before we look elsewhere. So that's my little polemic. So some of the things that are said about this group of artists, F.N. Souza, who you'll see upstairs, is usually called, you guessed it, the Indian Picasso. Hussein, well, slight lack of imagination here, he is also called the Indian Picasso. Taib Mehta, sometimes he is called, especially when he was in Britain, the Indian Francis Bacon. Yeah, just a little comparison. So we don't have a problem with size over here. The comments continue. Taib Mehta gets so fed up of this comparison, which he hears most of his life, that he decides he's doing his own spoof of Bacon. So as you can see over here, he's got, I put a painting of Bacon and a painting of Taib, who's used his own iconography, which if you go upstairs, the bull and sort of the Mahishasura, Durga fighting the buffalo demon. And so he's used some of that as well as an obvious reference to Francis Bacon, as if to say, you want me to be like Bacon? Here you are. So the comments continue. Raza is the Indian Cézanne or Paul Klee, depending on which period. And V.S. Gaitonde, and we'll encounter him again, is the Indian Mark Rothko. So the list of would-be Indians who derive their greatness from the West appears to be endless. So Indian art is, by this comparison, it really suffers the worse for wear. The modern Indian artist is characterized as derivative, backward, also like, lesser than. And hence you have comments like this. So this is a fairly contemporary Indian artist looking backwards. And he says, the modern Indian artist was the favorite whipping boy of art professors, newspaper reviewers, and columnists. He was pronounced Western, brutalist, imitative, and sterile. So when Bunhui and I decided we wanted to stage a progressive revolution to counteract this dialogue, and like all self-proclaimed revolutions, our show aims to answer an argument. It aims to answer this particular issue and pose an argument that is based on what has gone on before. So I think you kind of need to understand the landscape in which this particular revolution is being staged. So it fits and is an answer to an art history of suppression. And what suppression, you ask? Well, that of Western modernism for what is excluded from its ambit, until quite recently. This talk will therefore interrogate interconnected terms, the progressive, the modern, and its relative modernism. But first things first. What is modern Indian art, and what makes something Indian? Now that's a question we'll be discussing a lot today. But for now, what makes anything modern? Well, there's the Oxford Dictionary definition, always a nice place to start, which says the modern means state of the art. It is also defined as of or pertaining to present or current times. In Shakespeare, the term is used with the sense of everyday, ordinary, and commonplace, not quite our sense. And of course, there's a very important way it is used, modern conveniences. The ordinary toilet. First recorded usage being 1926. And in this sense, the modern dovetails with what we think of art historically as quintessentially modern, Marcel Duchamp's famous urinal. In art history, the term has to do with art that made a break with the past. And this is a narrative I'm going to contest just a little bit and slightly. Sometimes literally poo-pooing it. No pun intended. Actually, I lie. Pun intended. Art has made us think about tradition in a new way. So it is worth making another link with the term. Modernity, as a historical category, modernity refers to a period marked by a questioning of tradition. Questioning, I didn't say rejection. The prioritization of individualism, freedom, and formal quality. For the writer Charles Baudelaire, modernity, in his 1864 essay, The Painter of Modern Life, refers to a particular relationship to time, one characterized by intense historical discontinuity or rupture, openness to the novelty of the future, and a heightened sensitivity to the present. And then, of course, we have that very problematic category that we're taking to task today, modernism. And to this definition, you should listen very carefully, if only so that you can criticize it. Modernism is a style or movement in the arts that aims to depart significantly from classical and traditional forms. According to a very famous museum in London, which for lack of in an attempt to be uncharacteristically discreet, I am referring to as state modern, this is what modernism is. It contains a specific trajectory. Significantly, this museum, State Modern's website tells us, or told us, I don't know if they've taken it down since I last gave this lecture, and they complained bitterly. I never said any name. Modernism refers to the broad movement in Western arts and literature that gathered pace around 1850 and is characterized by a deliberate rejection of styles of the past. Western arts and literature, by the way. Emphasizing instead innovation, experimentation in form, materials, and techniques in order to create artworks that better reflect modern society. Well, this museum also tells us the terms modernism and modern art are generally used to describe the succession of art movements. This is a bit you should listen to very carefully. Which art movements? The realism of Courbet, and culminating in abstract art, such as American Abstract Expressionism, Bartlett Newman, and Mark Rothko, and its developments in the 1960s, such as British op art, for example, Bridget Riley, and minimalism. So far, so Western, I'm afraid, or rather, Euro-American. So he's modern. So this is the narrative we are taught and told, and for those of us who sort of work within academia in art history, it's very much the reigning narrative, which is only in the last few years beginning to be properly contested from within the discipline. So although many different styles are encompassed by the term, there are certain underlying principles that define modernist art. A rejection of history and conservative values, innovation, experimentation with form, a tendency to abstraction. And these are all things that if you walk around upstairs, you will see in the progressive artist group. And yet, heretofore, they've been more or less left out of the dialogue. So the thing that is sort of associated with the modern moment is very much an idea of a utopia. Yeah? So often modernism was in general associated with ideal visions of human life and society and a belief in progress. So Mondrian's paintings are usually read as a high point of this kind of progressive utopian optimism. Now here you have an contemporary Indian artist's take on this kind of westernized modernism. So he's taken Mondrian and he's put cracks in it, hence cracks in Mondrian is the name, and he's connected it to what looks like sort of PVC pipes that you see on Bombay's buildings. And of course, part of what he's doing is that he's sending up the notion of the utopian that is associated with this high modernist movement. But another thing that he's also doing is sending up the idea of a Western modernism that leaves no space for anything outside the Western dialogue. So this send-up this is a visual counterpart to an intellectual argument that gets made by a group of theorists called the subaltern theorists. And they are Ranjit Guha, Dipesh Chakravarti, and Partha Chatterjee in specific, have taken issue with the notion of the modern as linked to progress. For them, when concepts of modernity and the modern are tied to progress in this way, it always leaves non-Western cultures on the back foot, because it invariably means that they are found backward and their achievements have been arrived at first by definition in the progressive West. In terms of modern art, then, we hear some of the comments that I've already iterated, like modern Asian art is derivative. Hence, Hussein looks like Picasso, Souza looks like Picasso, Raza looks like Clay, Gaitonde is just like Rothko. Where? Anyway. In Revenge, if the subalterns seek to revise the definition of the modern for a post-colonial context, for others the term needs to be discarded altogether, as itself an outdated category, out of sync with more liberal times. However, in the Indian art world, even as we speak, the term modern and modernism, and this is why I think looking at the progressive artist group, who are the quintessential Indian moderns, is important at this particular moment. It's because this term is being diligently exhumed, even as we speak. So Karen Zitzowitz's book, The Art of Secularism, talks about understanding the modern's relevance for the politics of secularism today. Rebecca Brown's Art for a Modern India discusses how we have to acknowledge that even within its ideology of progress, the modern contains a paradoxical counter-move within itself. So this is a little complex, but it's also very important because she says that there was always a valorization of the deep past, even within the modern. So within the modern, you already have a celebration of the pre-modern, the primordial, the primitive, implicit within the concept of the modern. Perhaps one can say that this pre-modern core of the modern, the former usually inspired by the non-Western other, is a species of displaced Orientalism, a product and extension, in fact, of the colonial encounter. This, says Brown, is very clear when we look at the history of modern art in the West. And you can even see it in the modern art in America. And I'm going to revisit this concept, which is why I'd like you to have a look at it now. So even with somebody like Bartlett Newman, you have this kind of influence of the pre-modern, the traditional, that is feeding into his construction of the modern. And let's be very clear, this pre-modern influence is usually taken from and used from what are not traditionally Western cultures. And this, of course, has an impact for the Indian moderns when they are reusing the same territory, which they see as belonging to them, but has already been colonized visually by others. Okay, so here you have a serpent mound in Ohio. And Bartlett Newman's wonderment that comes out of it. Okay. Meanwhile, Sonal Kolar in Worldly Affiliations argues that the spectre of the modern continues to haunt the contemporary, and this is why it's important for us today. At any rate, the modern is back in fashion in the Indian art world, and whether this is because the prices of the category dubbed Indian modern art are riding high, or whether the prices of the Indian moderns reflect the turn towards the modern that academia has taken, is anyone's guess. But my guess would be it doesn't really have that much to do with academia. It might have something to do with the market, but that, I hope when you go away from this, what you will take away is that there's a reason for this for the fascination in general with modern Indian art, specifically identified with this group of progressive artists. So be that as it may, when it comes to Indian art, when was modernism? Indian art historian Geeta Kapoor has written a book trying to answer the question. She has, unsurprisingly, a fondness for the term and has never really let it go. Kapoor argues that the modern has nothing to do with when something is produced, but the sensibility behind its production. Modernism in India is colloquially in art historical circles linked to the progressive artist group, the bad boys of the 1940s and 50s art world who made a radical rupture and redefined the nation, sometimes kicking and screaming. For better or for worse, this lecture is their story. Group picture. Okay. So group picture, your revolutionary spirit will bring you many troubles, Sousa was told. Also brought him the title of an exhibition. So in 1947, F.N. Sousa founded the Progressive Artists Group, along with Raza, Hussain, Ara, Gade, and Bakri. They were later joined by others. In 1953, Christian Khanna, Banu Ataya, who was the first and only woman associated with this group, so there was one, V.S. Gaitonde, and Mohan Samant, who is usually left out of the dialogue, but not by us, because he was very much in there in the documentation that I found. They are also associated with Taib Mehta and Akbar Padamsi, so you can see them upstairs too. So we've been quite generous with the term and definition of the progressive artist group. Although, as I hope you've seen upstairs, this has a logic, because these are artworks and artists who are very much visually talking to each other. So there's a resonance between the works and also how they've been organized. So I've been quite careful to group the artists in a way that have underscored their similar preoccupations even after the group dissolved in the mid-1950s. And hence, even though the group dissolves, the artists who were associated with it were still very much in conversation. So, I mean, Sousa, as you know, leaves in 1949, very early on in the day, shortly after their first inaugural group show, to go to London. Raza goes to France. Bakre also goes to London, and they constantly travel. And the only one who very, very much wants to be associated with at this point and never really leave India is Hussein, of course, until he is forced out he's forced out in 2006 for painting goddesses in the nude, and there's something like 300 court cases brought against him. And ironically, his defense is, I'm an artist, I'm an Indian, that is all. So he's the only one of this group that very, very much ties himself to Indian identity continuously throughout this period, and yet is also the one who dies in exile, which I think is quite sad. So, as you'll see in the show, we pick up on the resonances, and here I've given you a little breakthrough of how people, when they say the progressive artist group, this is the group that is usually given prominence. So as you'll see from the slide, they're the ones who are considered the most important, and that's the top section. They're those who are usually not left out of the narrative, but they're not really given that much prominence, and that's Gade and Bakre. And then there's a guy called Mohan Samant who is usually left out altogether, as I said. So this is the usual idea of the progressive artist group in the popular imagination. This is what research proved. There was the core, that's the 6, and as you go up and enter the exhibition, you will see a big picture of this initial core 6. Then there was second wave, which is 1953, and I found in that catalogue Krishan Khanna, V.S. Gaitonde, and Mohan Samant, so card-carrying member. Also Banu Ataya, who is the only woman artist associated with this group. And then there were the very close associates like Akbar Padamsi and Taib Mehta. And those two have usually in traditional dialogues always been included as, very central to the group. In fact, when we went to talk to Akbar Padamsi, he said, I do not play in a group. However, he didn't want to be left out of the show. And it also became very clear that there was such a lot of back and forth, that there were letters that went back and forth. They shared friendships. I won't say women, but you can guess. And they fought a lot, sometimes for very personal reasons, but a lot of the time because they were squabbling about formal developments in their work. So, yeah, I mean, this was a group that whatever the sort of dictionary definition was who was there in the first, second, and third phase, everybody who's been included very much was having a conversation other than when they were deliberately ignoring somebody else. So why is this group so important in the symbolic imagination of, a characterization of modern Indian art? So the group was composed of artists from widely differing social, religious, and caste backgrounds. Raza was a Muslim from Madhya Pradesh. His father worked as a forest ranger. You can see upstairs. You have Ara, was born in semi-rural Andhra Pradesh in 1914. He was the son of a bus driver, and he was a Dalit, i.e. the lowest caste. It was only when he ran away from home and became a domestic servant in Bombay that he discovered he could paint. His work was mostly figurative. And the 1915-born Hussein, perhaps the most famous in the popular imagination of this group, started his career as a painter of billboards and cinema hoardings. And he was also really poor. So all of the ones who become iconic are also the ones who did not come from very well-off families. In fact, the ones who we remember least, hopefully after this show, there'll be like a sort of a re-looking at them, like Bakre and Gade. They actually came from the most upper middle class families. So ironically, this was a group where you had the outsider artists, or people who would have been considered outsiders, Muslim. Sousa was Roman Catholic, and came from Goa, which was a Portuguese colony all the way until 1961. So all of these guys were iconic, but they did not come from rich families. They did not come from the majority religion, which is Hinduism. And hence, they very much came to symbolize an idea of India that was really inclusive, plural, secular, multi-religious, and sort of cut through, societal barriers. And here you have, particularly important, is you can see Hussein as well. And Hussein draws very much from his early experiences of cinema, hoarding, painting, and very much from the Indian street. So again, I mean, he might be looking to Indian fine art and high art, which I will argue in a minute, but he's also looking towards the lowly processions. And this is what he's influenced by. Like that. Okay, Sousa came from an impoverished Roman Catholic family in Goa and was brought up by his mother. And if you look at birth very carefully here, you can see the effect of the stained glass windows of churches characterized quite clearly. So all these images are actually quite iconically associated with the Indian moderns. But why modern? So let's look at the landscape the progressives stepped into to see what the fuss is about. After all, if you ask what's new about this, we have to have some sense of what's old. So what were they reacting to? That's what they were reacting to. Colonial past and pretty pictures. So here we have Raja Ravi Varma, neoclassical style, also called academic realism, very much a product of scientific realism, which was taught in British art schools, how to make the natives understand scientific perspective, and this is what happens. So lots of buxom damsels who usually found their way into nice biscuit boxes, and the romantic fantasies of housewives. And others, of course. So this is one of the things they sought to break away from, but they also sought to break away from the delicate gouaches of the Bengal school art, like people like J.R. Chugtai, Abindranath Tagore, who tried to recreate India's courtly regal past in a soft, nostalgic manner, inspired by Japanese wash techniques as well as courtly Mughal miniatures. In his polemic essay, Words and Lines, and Sousa is always polemic, he's also a beautiful writer. So, and he says very wicked things. So I'm going to quote one of the very wicked things, and I didn't say it, he did. He said, condemned academic realism as fit only for, I quote, English mem sahibs who paint to pass the time between playing with teacups and their chaprasis. He also belittled the effete Bengal school, his word, for producing sentimental pictures. He wanted a new art for the newly created India. So there's no doubt that the progressives' artistic revolution was also embedded in a socio-political one. Sousa, the group's main ideologue, mainly because he talked the most and wrote the most, was expelled for participating in the Quit India movement, i.e. asking the British to get out, while studying at the J.J. School of Art in Bombay. So the progressives' first meetings were held in the Communist Party of India's headquarters, of which Sousa was a card-carrying member of the time, until he fought with them. He later rebelled against the party's privileging of social realism over the progressives' more progressive, what he saw as the more formalist experiments. So you have a group of artists who are rooted in socialist causes, but you also have them distancing themselves with more sort of realistic styles of depicting that. So they're not propaganda art. They very much see themselves as modernist and exploring form. However, their early paintings, this is Sousa during the first show, 1949, explaining why they use the term progressive to describe themselves. Though being Sousa, most of the article is dissing the term progressive, also saying that he doesn't like it because it's associated with these silly communists who he is not talking to anymore, and then finally signing himself off proudly as a secretary of the Progressive Artist Group. So he's clinging to this term progressive, but in his sense, what it means is an experimentation with form. It's also it's a kind of break with tradition in one sense, while it funnels into a specific tradition on the other, and this we will see. But they are quite socially aware. Especially Ram Kumar at this period. So Sousa himself paints the beggars. Ram Kumar is famous for paintings like Vagabond and what we've got upstairs, the unemployed undergraduates. So this is what you first kind of encounter. Meanwhile, Taib Mehta's Trust Bull is that image is very much aware and a response to the partition riots in Bombay in 1947. And also you have to remember that Taib is Muslim. And so he chooses to stay in India, but has a very, he is constantly sort of looking at the result of the partition as something to be dealt with, as something that split the subcontinent, and for him had a very personal effect because members of his family would have moved and he didn't. So here is a fairly iconic painting that he does, a similar one you can see upstairs from the same period where the diagonal comes in. And usually Taib Mehta's diagonals, he starts making them in the 1970s, and after he comes to America on a Rockefeller grant, and the usual dialogue about them, yes, you guessed it, he was inspired by Bartlett Newman. However, the diagonals also come in the 70s, and this is my argument, because what happens in 1971 is a second partition of the subcontinent. And here you can see very close, clearly that the kind of partition of the figure, the sort of splitting apart, has a political significance, and especially if you know and that what happens in 1971 is the sort of the body of the nation is split yet again. So as paintings like this upstairs, the Lost Sousa, demonstrate, the progressives forged a unique visual language for a new Indian citizen, emerging from the shadows of the colonial past and a bloody divided present, to forge a new sense of self. The images often speak of pain, but they also gesture to resurrection. Hence it is the progressives who have always had a purchase on the term the moderns, or the Indian moderns, because they also serve to make a rupture with tradition, the colonial past, as well as carving out a model of the present. Within the group, as I said, we have a range of backgrounds. Raza and Sousa were Muslims, Ara Dalit, Sousa a Christian. Raza and Hussein were Muslims, Ara Dalit, Sousa a Christian. Gaitonde, Bakre and Gade were Brahmins, Tito Banu. And moreover, even in the early years of their formation, they were hugely international in their reach. Why? Because you had the influence of three Austrian Jewish immigrants from Hitler's Germany, Emanuel Schlesinger, Rudi von Leyden, and the critic and editor of Times of India, Walter Langhammer, whose portrait is the first one sees when you visit the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay. And this institute has the biggest collection of progressives, possibly in Bombay itself. So these mentors encouraged the progressives to look to Europe. For instance, Schlesinger accompanies Padamsee and Raza to Paris in 1950. Even as they encourage them, and now wait for it, to look at their own folk and high art traditions. So it's not a parochial idea of nationalism that we're going to be fleshing out, which is a particularly important role model for us today. And there are, as I said, two strands to the openness of the progressives. Firstly, it forms, for all their modernity, a particular relationship to the Indian past, which I will call secular. And secondly, it allows us to build bridges between certain members and their interests in the West. In our case, since this is what the show does with the Rockefellers. So as I said, there was a deliberate attempt to construct a dialogue with the Asian antiquities from the Rockefeller collection and the Indian modern works. So let's look at the early stages of the Indian dialogue. We know that thanks to Radcliffe, amongst others, two new nations were forged in blood with very different dialogues. In India's own rhetoric, this represented was that India was secular, Pakistan was Muslim. India, said its national propaganda, welcomes all religions of the subcontinent. However, not everybody agreed. So there was a faction that thought that India should be a Hindu nation. And for them, as we have said, India's Muslim past had to be obliterated. And this ends up with the shooting of Gandhi. And hence you have a section in the show which starts with the death of Gandhiji. And this is Christian Khanna's painting. So it becomes, with the death of Gandhi, very important, and more important than ever, for India's liberals to find symbolic ways of reclaiming the idea of a secular, multi-religious India. The fact that neither Hussein nor Raza, both Muslim artists, left for Pakistan, despite the fact that they had relatives who moved, made them perfect candidates for becoming symbols of Indian inclusivity. Raza and Hussein became vital to forging an idea of a liberal, secular, inclusive, plural India. And so you have these two artists who are constantly mythologized. So you have Spider and the Lamp, and a stamp is made out of it, and Raza's Bindu, and a stamp is made out of it. And most importantly, for anyone interested in Indian nationalism and identity in general, the figure of Hussein is vital. So here you have the famous Hussein mural that sits at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. In images like this, we can recognize many mythic characters as well as the folksy landscape of Rajasthan, the mural traditions of Ajanta and Ellora caves in Maharashtra. Because this vast image, much like movable seminar hoardings, also references the traveling bards who used to recite the Mahabharata on large scrolls during Mughal times. So here you have a practicing Muslim artist deliberately mining Hindu traditions to create what is a syncretic dialogue. And of course he is drawing on other instances in the subcontinent's past where this has happened. And so I'll take you through this very, very quickly. But what I want you to notice is that this kind of language is very much about a Nehruvian India and Nehru's concept of unity and diversity. It refused to come for some reason, the bull. But yeah, so Moram processions as well as Hindu processions. And this is, of course, the very famous Mughal painting of Akbar, who the Emperor Akbar, who invents a new religion for the subcontinent, which is a combination of Jain, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian motifs. And there you see Akbar talking to two Jesuits. So it's this kind of sort of very plural South Asia that someone like Hussein is drawing on. See, so things like that. So during Akbar's reign, the Hindu epics are translated into Persian from Sanskrit. And very much in the flavor of Nehru's Republic Day parades, which are very inclusive, different sort of folk cultures, sort of different tribes and different communities all come together. And Hussein's man draws on these traditions. So both sort of Jain temple carvings. And there you can see the influence on that. And this is an iconic Hussein. And if you ever were to look at it and decode it, you can find all these various sort of modernist symbols actually reference very specific things within Indian culture. But of course, there's a figure of the artist in the middle. Also, the sort of the obvious reference to the hand, which you'll see somewhere in that painting, is Le Corbusier's Chandigarh, where you have the hand emblem. So Nehru invites Le Corbusier to design and build a new city for the Punjab, because Lahore has been given to Pakistan. And in this city that Le Corbusier designs, a very modernist city, you have the famous hand symbol. And you see this appearing again and again in Hussein's iconography. So there's a very deliberate construction of the modern that draws on the traditional, but also on what is happening in terms of the urban and the reinventions of an Indian landscape through Nehru. I'm going to go rather quickly through the next bit. It's just to set the stage a little bit for the kind of references that they're making. And so a kind of hybrid syncretic dialogue, which is vital to modern Indian art and secularism. And you have, of course, two narratives that happen with India on the one hand and Pakistan on the other. And for Pakistan, the emperor, the great Mughal, who is the most important, is Aurangzeb. For India, particularly the liberal secular artists, the emperor who never was is very important, and that is Aurangzeb's brother, Dara Shikoh, who is killed by Aurangzeb, but who was a Sufi, a practicing Sufi, and was seen as the most syncretic ruler that ever would have been within the subcontinent. But of course, we have no way of verifying that because he was killed by Aurangzeb. And so this is the sort of tradition of painting that people like Hussein and the progressives are looking at. And so when I sort of contrast upstairs, you'll see the contrast with Rajasthani painting, but also you can very clearly see references to Pahari painting. This is because there's a symbolic significance to Pahari painting, which is the painting from the Punjab hills, from the Himalayan hills. And this starts to happen because Dara Shikoh, when he's fleeing from his brother, brings along miniaturists who go along with him. He dies and is he's brought back in chains, and he's killed by the brother, but they stay behind, and a whole new tradition of painting is born. And so it's in the public and sort of popular imagination, that kind of painting, miniature painting, is very much seen as the sort of the genesis of a syncretic language. So it's very symbolic that when the progressives draw from things, they are drawing from Rajasthani painting, Rajput painting, and Pahari painting, which has this sort of hybrid history. And hence, we've made this kind of contrast. So this is where Pahari painting would have come from. You can see right from the top. Bashali, which Hussein talks about a lot, just have a look at the map. It's from Jammu and Kashmir, right at the top, which is now disputed territory between India and Pakistan. And of course, Rajasthani miniatures is what Raza draws from. So as you can see upstairs, we've contrasted it with, we've contrasted Raza's work with what he would have been inspired from. You can also see that in the next image, Hussein's Between the Spider and the Lamp, which is not upstairs, but there are other works that are, contrasted here deliberately with Bashali painting, which is a kind of Pahari painting. And Hussein explicitly says that he is influenced by Gupta sculpture, Bashali painting, and the folk. And if you remember, Bashali is a form of Pahari painting. So it's a very secular, syncretic, multi-religious past that they're drawing upon to construct their modern language. And this is what we've got upstairs. Which feeds me right into our end game, which is India International. So the Asia Society show aims to bat outside the ordinary box about modern Indian art being derivative. And it does this, as I've said, in two ways, by using the Rockefeller collection. So firstly, as we've seen, it makes a point of what these Indian artists were looking at apart from the West within their own tradition. But secondly, I think what it also does is bring them into a dialogue with the Rockefellers, particularly the founder of the Asia Society himself, J.D. Rockefeller III. So J.D. founded the Asia Society Museum in 1956, and the permanent collection, which we're using in this way, comes from him and his Asian antiquities. So on the face of it, it looks like J.D. Rockefeller's seed collection at the Asia Society is very much part of the traditional narrative that, if you're looking at Asian art, we must be stuck in some kind of past la-la land. However, by doing this kind of juxtaposing of the modern with the traditional in this way, it's an attempt to interrupt and break this dialogue. And some of the works that we've collected here come directly out of the collection with a very important guy called Thomas Keane. So as you go upstairs, you can see the Hussein's Yatra actually belonged to Thomas Keane. Now, who was Thomas Keane and why was he important to Rockefeller? Well, because he was the Rockefeller agent within India, who was sent as a cultural and economic attaché, and he amassed a vast collection of modern Indian art. And this is why he very much disrupts the dialogue, because in 1959, he organizes an exhibition at the Graham Gallery in New York of modern Indian art, because he and his wife, Martha, are so enthused by it. And when they bring around Munro Wheeler from MoMA comes to visit them, and they take him around all these modern Indian artists in Bombay studios, and he comes back and he says there's no modern Indian art. There's no art in India that's worthy of being shown at MoMA. So Thomas and Martha Keane are quite annoyed at this. And while they help him to put together an exhibition of textiles, they also disrupt him by a few years later putting together a show of modern Indian paintings. And we can see from this catalogue that even though it's 1959, so early in the day, that J.D. Rockefeller and his wife don't just own Asian antiquities, they are also collecting modern Indian art, even though, according to Munro Wheeler, it doesn't exist. So that's J.D. Rockefeller and Blanchette's Raza, and we call it the Rockefeller Raza. And we so there's that picture of it. And now my last section, which makes this argument. So the Rockefeller scholarships started from 1959 to the early 1970s, so after this Trends in Painting show. And J.D. Rockefeller III and his wife started plowing money to encourage modern Indian art. And they gave almost all of the second wave of the progressive artists were given scholarships to come to New York, but also to explore other areas in Asia. However, as those of you who have been upstairs and came to the tour might know, in 1964, thanks to the Rockefeller Fellowship, Gaitonde and Christian Khanna met Mark Rothko. And so even though Gaitonde has often been called the Indian Mark Rothko, they discovered something. That in 1964, both Mark Rothko and Gaitonde were similarly inspired. And the thing that inspired them was East Asian art, i.e. Chinese and Japanese scrolls, Chinese calligraphy, Zen Buddhist paintings. So this is my point. Even at the heart of the American modern, which the Rockefellers represent, and certainly you will agree that Rothko does, there is a vision of Asia. And this vision of Asia is what I think we should highlight today. So using the timeless past, i.e. the antiquities that the Rockefellers invested in terms of the seed collection of the Asia Society, I think, and juxtaposing them with modern Indian artists, I think marks a gentle subversion of the original narrative of the modern in America. Certainly, this should change our views on the progressive, the secular, and the modern. But most importantly for us gathered here today is to note that at the core of the American modern is a vision of Asia. And in this Asia, at least for the moment at Asia Society, India plays a vital part. Thank you.